This is video 2 of week 2. And the first thing that we have to do is to define our object of study. So for this video, I'm going to introduce the question of who is multilingual, who counts as a multilingual person. And for that, we will have to see, crucially, that there is not a single definition, but mostly that there is a variety of ways in which a person can be multilingual. There's types of multilinguals, if you might. So the first one, the first observation is that everybody knows borrowings in their language. We all talk about pizzas, sushi, and so on and so forth. So everybody knows words that belong to another language, and they have come into being a normal item in our language. So sometimes we don't even perceive them as different words, but they technically are, because their origin can be traced easily to other words. Sushi, we all know, comes from Japanese, even though when we speak English, we don't think twice about using it as if it were a normal word of the English language. So everybody, to a certain extent, is that kind of multilingual, in which they know at least a few words that originally can be put in another language. So that's the first type. Now, the second type of multilingual is being a second language learner. We apply this label to people who have learned a language once they had already a very solid linguistic system in place. So if I am a speaker of Dutch and I have acquired language later in life, and I can't even remember when I started acquiring the language, and I didn't feel that to be my language, for example, that means a second language. Even if it's not your second language, even if you already spoke Dutch and Frisian in your family, so you were bilingual already, so technically that English would be a third language. But we call it a second language, sometimes an additional language, because it is properly an additional language. And we refer to that term when we say that we learn it in a different way and later in life, typically, from other languages that we might have, though that's another kind of multilingual. This refers to the label simultaneous versus sequential multilinguals, or simultaneous versus sequential language acquisition. Simultaneous versus sequential multilingualism. Look at these terms again. Remember what it means that I put them in boxes. Look at these terms. Look for these terms in the reading. Now, a different kind of multilingual is what we have been calling heritage speakers. Those are speakers that acquire language in the context of family, Sunday school, even a bilingual school, very early on. But that language does not have a general social representation in their community. That's why we call it heritage. Heritage as for it's a special family language that they have inherited that is different from their neighbors or the people in their school, etc. Those are called heritage speakers. Many times heritage speakers are linked to issues of history of migration, either their own migration or most likely the migration of their parents. And those are treated differently because typically, for example, their language does not have any support in the school system. Sometimes it doesn't even have support in the community or at the social and political level. So they just have different languages as a matter of their own inheritance, their personal inheritance. Now, there is the situation of social bilingualism. We apply that label to situations in which the whole of the community speaks two languages, sometimes both of them languages, two or more, of course. Sometimes all of those languages are recognized officially. That is the case, say, of in Catalonia, you have Catalan and Spanish being spoken by everybody, and that's supported at the state level, at the political level. The goal of the educational system is to create bilingual speakers in both languages. So there you become bilingual by the mere fact of belonging to that community. I say bilingual. When I say bilingual, I mean any kind of multilingual. It just means acquiring several languages at the same time. And in this case, obviously, because of just having been born not in a particular family, your family might actually be quite monolingual, but in a particular community. The bilingual or trilingual schools are typically the favorite tools or the preferred tools to support that kind of social bilingualism. So here in Friesland, for example, we have, in order to preserve the richness of the region, which is historically a bilingual situation in which you have Dutch and Frisian, it was, however, it was thought that if you were to promote, because of the sociology of the region and the kind of perceptions that people have of Frisian specifically, and the relative role of Frisian and Dutch, it was thought that in order to preserve bilingualism, the bilingualism of the region, they had better promote a trilingual school system in which English was also very much part of the system, as much as the other two almost. And the promise to the parents was that if they enrolled their kid in these trilingual schools, they will be learning Dutch, obviously, because of being in the Netherlands, and they will be learning Frisian because Frisian was part of the educational system also, and crucially, they will be learning very good English. Actually, they will be learning much better English in these trilingual schools than they would be learning in monolingual Dutch schools. So parents did like that people were that their kids were learning obviously Dutch and Frisian, but they really liked that they would be learning very good English, because that's what's a hot thing to do here in the Netherlands. So many parents would choose a trilingual school over a Dutch-only school on the basis of this support for English. And almost as a secondary consequence, they would be preserving Frisian for the children. So the state officials thought that this was a good way of preserving Frisian, much more effective than if they would have imagined a bilingual school, Dutch and Frisian, which might have perceived as a hindrance, as it was loading the children with one more language that the parents otherwise were happy to just take care of at the level of the family. So there are many strategies, and each community has to figure out what strategy works better to preserve their social bilingualism. That is their goal. Now, you will, in relation to this issue, you will encounter the label additive versus subtractive multilingualism. And please look it up on the readings. And basically, it makes reference to whether whenever you acquire a new language, it needs that it kind of takes the space of another language that you might be acquiring or that you even have, or it can actually just cumulate one language over the other, and if there's limits of that. We can discuss about that during seminar. There is this special term also, which is a technical term, of diglossia. Diglossia just means when a community decides not to, for example, in the case of the Frisians, not to include all of the languages in the, for example, the public life or school system, but actually decide that some of the languages belong to the private sphere and some of the languages to the educational sphere or to the public sphere, to the political sphere, to the intellectual sphere, to the religious sphere. So sometimes a community organizes the linguistic diversity of the society it is in many different ways, putting all of the languages together for all of the functions, or distributing the different languages in the different personal and social functions. So these are different ways in which a person might become multilingual, in these different lifestyles, if you want, or cognitive and personal makeshifts of being multilingual. with all these other labels that are applied to typifying or to classifying multilinguals is whether they are balanced versus unbalanced multilinguals, whether they have receptive versus productive multilingualism, and so forth. So look for those terms in the reading and bring them to seminar if you have any doubts. So regarding the proficiency of multilinguals, meaning how much they know of the languages, of the different languages, and how much they use the different languages, there are several myths about how bilinguals, and again, when I say bilinguals, I mean multilinguals too. This is a simplification. So there are several myths about what the knowledge and the use of the different languages they make, right? So there is the myth that in order to be a bilingual, you have to have a balance, exactly corresponding balance between the different abilities. The different abilities being understanding, speaking, reading, and writing. Those are the ones that we normally typify. Obviously, eventually it is also a matter of the ability to communicate, whether you are able to communicate to the exact same degree in every one of your languages. And if you don't, then you are not a multilingual. The reality of multilinguals is that that's hardly the case. So a multilingual person can have different proficiency in their languages, and that's actually the norm. So they can also have different proficiency among their languages. So the one language, they might know understanding and speaking and reading, and the other one, they know understanding, speaking, reading, and writing. You can also in one language have a writing ability only, and in the other language have an understanding, speaking, reading, and writing ability. So among their languages and in their languages, also they might have a different proficiency. A multilingual can understand and speak their language and not read and write their language because they've never been to school, for example, in that language, and so forth. So both within a single language of a multilingual, same way as with a monolingual. So within a single language and among the different languages, they might have different proficiencies. Actually, that's the typical case. They can also have different attitudes towards this language. They might have different languages and feel differently about each one of them. They might like one of their language better than the other one. They might actually hate one of their languages. They might just be indifferent about a third language, etc. They also might have different social situations in which they use their language. In the case of diglossia that I have already mentioned to you. So they might use one language only within their family and another language only in their workspace. They might use one language to speak about their feelings, and they have to speak about their feelings in that particular language. They might use another language to speak about their intellectual concepts or their work, and then not being able to speak about that in any other language than that. They're still multilinguals. They're still perfectly balanced bilinguals. They just have different distribution in the uses and in the social situations in which they use the language. And finally, they might have different opportunities for the formal study of their languages. Not all of the languages of multilinguals might be present at school. And if a language is not present at school, it takes an extra effort to learn typically how to read and write, but also it's a matter of vocabulary to expand your vocabulary. And not everybody has the luxury of put that extra effort in supporting one of their languages. So it might be that they end up with different abilities and different supports in school and in the community of the different. So all of this is just to make you aware that the question of who counts as a multilingual is very complex. If I were to ask you, are you a multilingual? Probably people raise their hands that say no, they are not multilingual, they are monolingual in Dutch, but they know a little bit of English. But then it would be very weird that they say that if this is a class that I'm teaching in English and you're taking high-level courses in English, and then you don't consider yourself multilingual in English, but just second language speaker or something like that. Typically, there is more to it than that. So when the question of who counts as multilingual comes up, we have to consider many scenarios. For example, are you multilingual if you understand another language perfectly but don't speak it? Does that make you multilingual in the one that you don't speak, that you only understand? Are you multilingual if you speak another language fluently but cannot read or write it? Right? So does that still give you the status of being multilingual in the one, especially in the one that you cannot read or write it? Are you multilingual if you can read or write a language but not speak it? Right? Many people that have gone through higher education or specific kind of educational system, they know how to read and write Latin, but obviously they never had the opportunity to speak to anybody in Latin. Are they still multilingual in Latin? Should multilingualism be measured by how fluent people are in one or two more languages, or as many as they have? How fluent people are. If you're speaking a language and you are having hesitations all the time and you are not finishing your sentences in that particular language and you are in another language, for example, are you still multilingual in the one that you're having a little bit more difficulty expressing yourself in? What is that difficulty related to? Is it related to your knowledge of the language? Is it related to the typical communicative style or conversational style of the community in which that language is spoken? What are the different measures that we can apply to decide whether a person is fluent in a language or not? Now, are multilinguals only those who have equal competence in all of their languages? This is related to the former slide. If multilinguals mostly have different competences in the different languages, does that mean that a true multilingual is not there? Only the rare multilingual that has perfect matching of competencies, understanding, speaking, reading, and writing in all of their languages, even if those competencies might be very low, for example, or something like that. Who counts as multilingual? What other factors other than language proficiency should be used as a criterion for assessing multilingualism? So if it's not your knowledge of the language, what other factors might make you decide that a person is multilingual? The frequency in which that language is spoken by that person, the audience, what the audience think of how that person performs in that language. What are other factors other than just looking at very atomistically, looking at the different properties of the linguistic system of that speaker? Now, does it matter to our definition of multilingualism how people perceive themselves? Should we just cut to the chase and ask people, look, are you multilingual? And then you say, yes, I'm multilingual. Okay, you count as multilingual. Or do we want some kind of external evaluation to decide whether that person who might perceive themselves as multilingual actually count or do not count as multilingual? And finally, is multilingualism relative? For example, if you've grown up with two or more languages, but stop using one of the languages and lose proficiency because use it or lose it, do you stop being a bilingual? So imagine that I ask you, well, are you a multilingual? And I used to be. I used to be multilingual. Now I'm not anymore. Well, really? This is very weird because this is like saying I was at some point, I was a member of the speaker community of that language, or I was a multilingual, and now I stopped being a multilingual. That would be like, oh, well, I once was a nice person and I stopped being a nice person. Is that possible? So these are all sample questions of what we could consider when we put the label on someone as being multilingual or not. And here it would be very nice to have a discussion about what you think about all this. And I hope then to stop the video here, and I hope that in seminar then we can talk a little bit about this. So think about these things, about who counts as multilingual, how would you define a person to be multilingual, and how you think that we can settle the question of saying that, okay, these are the different characteristics that a person needs to have in order to be considered multilingual. So I'm going to stop the video here so that you can think about this, write down some observations, and bring them back to discussion.